Well, let me first thank conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak about the COVID-19 and global food and nutrition security, particularly the food supply chains. We're really facing unprecedented challenges right now. Just before the COVID-19, we are already facing hunger and malnutrition. And COVID-19 obviously will bring more poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. The COVID-19 has disrupted global supply chains. So we must do things differently. We must rethink of our global food systems, global supply chains, post-COVID-19. So first now we'll speak about the hunger and malnutrition just before the COVID-19. So for 2019, the FAO, the WFP, and IFPRI released a report saying that we have about 820 million people suffering from hunger and 144 million children are stunted. And on top of that, 2 billion people suffer from hidden hunger or lack of micronutrients. And 22 billion people suffer from overweight and obesity. So you can see we are facing multiple burdens of malnutrition. All this together will cost us almost 5, even to 10% of our GDP. So it is a human development issue, it is a health issue, but it is also an economic issue. So now, the COVID-19, yes, will hit us very hard, and particularly poor and hungry people. So the recent study from IFPRI shows that for every 1% economic growth slowing down, it will bring almost 14 million poor people. So IMF projected that in 2020, the global economy will shrink by 3% compared to the 3% projected positive growth of 2020. So together, we lose 6% of global GDP. So which also means that COVID-19 will lead to 80 to 90 more poor people if we use $1.9 per day poverty line. Another study, another report from the FAO, from IFPRI, and from World Food Program showed that COVID-19 will add another 130 million extreme hunger or hungry people to the world. Before the COVID-19, there were about 135 million extreme hungry people. So you can see, because of COVID-19, we will double the number to about 265 million extreme hungry people in the world. Now, of course, because of the slowed economic growth, people will have less money to purchase nutritious and healthy foods. So their nutrition status and finally health status will be compromised. We know that it is the people who have non-communicable diseases such as cancers, diabetes, or heart diseases that are mostly easily being affected. If they are affected, the death of these people are most likely to happen. Now, the COVID-19 clearly will cause major disruptions in our food supply chains. So we have seen that this is very different from 2007, 2008 food price crisis. So at that time, the food price crisis was triggered by the droughts and wheat supply shortages in Australia and Argentina. But that triggered the chain action to lead to panic export bans, particularly in the rice sector. So in the first 6 months of 2008, global rice price doubled or even tripled. Obviously, many people, poor people, suffered and went into hunger and poverty. But this time, the challenge is even much greater. Economic growth will slow down. That will affect demand side. So it is very important to observe that the prices of urban areas, the food prices in urban areas, have been depressed. It's very low, partly because of the purchasing power of these people have been affected. On the other hand, smallholder producers are also facing very low selling prices, so they cannot sell higher prices. So you will see that both consumers and the producers are facing low prices. So the whole value chain, supply chain, has been broken. And there is heterogeneity along the whole supply chain. So it is smallholders, it is small traders, it is small and medium-sized enterprises that will suffer much more than anybody else. So that heterogeneity also affects our global supply chain. Now, in particular, some of the labor-intensive food supply chains or enterprises have been affected. And labor shortages have also been a challenge. Now, in terms of consumption, obviously, the urban poor, particularly women, children, elderly, do not have enough income to purchase nutritious and healthy foods. The trade has also been affected, not just because of export bans. Yes, we know that export bans is so bad. Export bans will exacerbate food price crisis, will lead to disruption of global supply chain. But in addition to export bans, the logistics, the port logistic facilities, the whole value chains that lead to port and then from the port to the destination have been affected. Now, the public programs in many countries, such as school feeding programs, social safety nets to protect poor and elderly, have also been affected. We have seen a tremendous increase of demand for food from the food banks. I have seen some numbers that the demand for food bank services has increased by 50% to 100%. So the whole value chain, supply chain has been disrupted. Now, so what will be a future global supply chain or future food systems? As researchers, as advisors, as policymakers, as investors, as business actors. So we must think very hard what sort of food system we would like to have. So before crisis, in let's say 2015, the United Nations adopted this so-called Sustainable Development Goals, so 17 goals. More than half of these goals are very much related to food systems. For example, health, nutrition, poverty, smallholders' income, natural resource management, climate change, reducing food waste and loss, and so on. But I think COVID-19 is a wake-up call for us. Two factors or two characteristics will be very prominent post-COVID-19. Number one is inclusion. The second is resilience. So I will come back to these two issues or 2 points in a bit in detail. So inclusion. We know that if the system is more inclusive, the people, including poor and hungry people, will benefit from economic activities. So they actually could also help the future growth. The future growth really depends on a more inclusive economic system. We also know that a more inclusive system or economic growth model will help to reduce poverty. We know that by 2030, we must eliminate all hunger, all poverty. So the poverty reduction is very critical, and inclusion is very important in achieving that goal. Then also, inclusion will help to break the cycles of poverty, hunger, malnutrition across different generations. We know that poverty, hunger, and malnutrition can carry from one generation to another, partly because our system has not been very inclusive. So the inclusion will be able to break that cycle. Now, obviously, the inclusive system will be able to reduce global and national inequalities. We have seen lots of political challenges in Europe, in US, in Latin America, and in lots of emerging economies, partly because of our system has not been very inclusive. Now, if we can launch a more inclusive development model, including very inclusive food systems. We can accelerate economic recovery from COVID-19. So the inclusion is imperative, is important, is essential. Now I wanted to emphasize smallholders. So smallholders, firstly, have been hit hard by COVID-19. They're already constrained by access to credit, training, land, and markets. And the COVID-19 will further hinder them to access to all these very crucial credit services, training services, land, and markets. So what can we do? We must make sure that the smallholders have access to agricultural inputs, must make sure that the land tenure will be able to help smallholders to access to land, and promote inclusive agribusiness models. So agribusiness must be able to benefit smallholders, and facilitate risk reduction by providing insurance, social protection, and income diversification for smallholders. Now, safety nets are even more critical during COVID-19 pandemic. As I have already said, it is poor people, it is hungry people, it is disadvantaged people who will suffer much more than anybody else. IFPRI study shows that additional 20% global increase in extreme poverty could happen without any help. So more than 20% of the people or extreme poverty will be increased because of COVID-19. So the safety net will be able to soften the impact on their diets, nutrition, and future economic growth. The migrant workers, many countries, including China and India, have so many migrant workers who have been affected by the current pandemic. They need a special policy, special program to help them. And lastly, resilience. So resilience is so critical to cope with and recover from shocks like COVID-19. So resilience is it's not just a buzzword. It has real meaning. It means the individuals, community, national governments, even global system have the capability to deal with the shocks in short run and recover and rebuild to prosper in the long run. Now here I wanted to offer several instruments to build the resilience. So number one is to invest in agriculture research. But today, the innovation from agriculture research should have multiple wins. Yes, wins in yield, wins in nutrition, but also wins in resilience. So the newer varieties should be able to stand against shocks, climate shocks, heat waves, and beyond, and diseases. And trade restrictions, we must make sure that trade remain open. We know that trade can help to build a global resilient system, and it can help to deal with shocks in different locations. And finally, empowerment of women. So here I just cannot emphasize enough that women plays a huge role in coping with COVID-19, in recovering from this pandemic, and to prosper in the future. So let me summarize several points here. So number one is to ensure global supply chain work, the green channels must be established to ensure smooth functioning of food supply chains. And second is smallholders, traders, SMEs need special support. And the third is new technologies, so not just agriculture technology, but also e-commerce platform should be encouraged. And protecting poor consumers, particularly women, children, and elderly. And if they have access to nutritious and healthy foods, and they will be able to cope with the shocks. They will be able to recover very quickly. And the trade must remain open. And finally, we must think very hard what sort of global supply chains, global food system we should have in the future. Resilience and inclusion must be part of that debate. Okay, let me thank you.